Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Ask the Experts. Normally it's plural, it's Ask the Experts, but as you can see, I'm solo today. So it's Ask the Expert without the plural. Liz may join us, she may not. As some of you may know, she runs the Houston or sorry, the OCD Institute in Texas, rather. And so she is maybe doing something with that. So she might pop in, she might not be able to, but I'm here. So I will be answering your questions today. Hi, Matt. It's already good to see you. Good to see everyone in the chat. So what I always like is just announce that you're here. As you may know, the IOCDF is an organization that is consisting of staff members as well as members of the community with OCD, clinicians, researchers. It's a big community of people that are trying to do as much as we can to make sure that people have education and resources and access to treatment and updated treatments and things like that. So we're just an organization of people that want to help. And so, hi, Amy. Hi, Shruti. So the thing is, these live streams are all for you. So I always like to hear where people are from. So the questions I always like to ask is like, say hi in the chat, let us know where you're from, and then also who you're here to support. So you're here to support yourself, or you're here to support a loved one or a family member or somebody you're a caregiver for, or a sibling with OCD. Are you a clinician yourself that is newer to OCD and wants to learn? Or maybe you are a avid OCD treatment provider that wants to join us. So announce where you're from. It's always good to hear where everybody is from. So just a little bit about myself. My name's Chris Trondsen. I have OCD. And so I went through, like most people, not being able to find adequate care, really struggling to find treatment, got some poor treatment, some talk therapy, or some other treatments that didn't work, and then was fortunate to come across the IOCDF. And there we found the OCD Center of Los Angeles, which is up in Westwood in California here, and was able to get adequate care with Karen Pickett, who is my therapist. We did a regimen of exposure and response prevention. I know she used a lot of mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy in there as well, and really worked it out. And also went and saw Ari Winograd for body dysmorphic disorder treatment. So diagnosed with both, and afterwards advocated for it through the IOCDF, which is what feels like home, and then ended up becoming a therapist. So now I'm a licensed therapist at a treatment center in Orange County, California, treating individuals with OCD, with body dysmorphic disorder, and then related disorders like hoarding and trick and skin picking and anxiety and depression. So I'm going to be answering the questions today sort of from both a lived experience and a clinical experience. And so I know we have a lot of pre-submitted questions, and I'm going to take questions live in the chat. So go ahead and drop your questions in. So any questions that you have, anything that you have about diagnosis or treatment or anything like that, I'm always real with treatment. Treatment was about 2 years. It was difficult, but it was invigorating. And I always tell clients, you kind of get your identity back. So it's super awesome. So anyways, go ahead and introduce yourself. Like I said, it's good to see you, Amy from Wisconsin. Matt, it's always good to see you as well, from the UK. So it's good to see everybody today. So a couple announcements just before we get started. So always remember that this live stream is intended to serve as educational content and is not intended to replace therapy. So what that means is we're going to be giving you support, answering questions, everything, but it's not therapy. So if you want to find a local treatment provider, make sure to go to iocdf.org/find-help. If you're in a crisis or you're feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or you can dial 988. Those are some numbers that you can find some safety if you're feeling unsafe. If you're feeling like you're not in a good place and need care, please make sure that you seek that out. Also, that we want to create as safe as possible space, so be kind and respect everyone. This is broadcast on various media platforms and is being recorded, so be mindful of that as you ask questions or leave comments. We're all here to support each other. And if you ever find anything helpful in this and want to watch it back, or you want to send it to somebody, don't forget that you can go to the IOCDF's YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/IOCDF, or you can go to the IOCDF's Facebook. So that's facebook.com/IOCDF. And there you can rewatch these virtual streams back live, or you could send it to people as well. A couple things that we are here to announce is so May 1st is the OCD and Faith Conference. So if you go to iocdf.org/conference, or conferences, Amanda will put the right one in the comments. You can sign up for the Faith Conference. So that's going to involve faith leaders. That's going to involve clinicians that work with individuals with faith. There's going to be people of faith. There's going to be people in the community. So what that conference is really aiming to do is to provide support for individuals that might be going through religious and moral scrupulosity, for people that are struggling with their faith and their mental health, and just a good way to make sure that people can get resources in that space. The other really exciting news is they just announced the registration is open now. Early bird pricing for the in-person IOCDF conference the weekend of July 7th, which is going to be in San Francisco here in California. So if you've never been to an in-person conference, it's incredible. It's an amazing opportunity to go to meet people in person. What I love about the conference is some of the people that you watch on live streams, or the books you've read, or the people you've read research from, or any of the people that advocate on social media and things like that. They are going to be at the conference, and they're in person. And I think what's really cool about that is they're super willing to answer questions, to meet you, talk with you, which is cool. It's very kind of like warm and comfortable feeling. So that's the second Saturday weekend second Friday, Saturday, Sunday weekend in July. So make sure that you sign up for that. And those are kind of like the big announcements coming up. I do know there is the IOCDF walks coming up. Those are going to be in June. So if you are by a local affiliate, they might be holding a walk. But if you're international, always do your own walk. The IOCDF gives you a lot of resources and stuff to be able to do that. So that's super exciting. So make sure that you are, kind of signing up for some of these cool things that you can do. And then, as always, every Tuesday evening and then Wednesday at this time, we have these live streams. So excited to have everyone. Yes. So Matt, so the virtual conference, I don't have the exact date, but it's going to probably be next month. So that's where people can start submitting conference submissions for the virtual conference. That's going to be in October. So definitely can do that. Hi, Betsy from Pennsylvania. I'm always kind of bad with like initials of states. So if I ever butcher, I don't know why. I know PA is Pennsylvania. So when I was a kid, I wanted to go to Hershey, Pennsylvania, because I thought the whole place was made of chocolate, and I was disappointed to find out it wasn't. So super excited to see everyone. Hi, OCD Crusher. It's great to see you. So what I'm going to do is I have some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to answer, but I also want to answer questions live. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring up before we get into questions, as the questions are kind of coming in, I want to talk a little bit about the way that we get fooled by OCD. And there's kind of a couple different ways that we get fooled. So the first way that we get fooled is thoughts, images, impulses, and feelings. And so that's one of the things that we do is we get absolutely tricked by those thoughts and feelings. So let's say somebody is driving and they have OCD around hit and run, and they drive and they get home and they start to think that they might have hit somebody. The presence of the thoughts and the feelings that come through are not things that we control. That's kind of part of the disorder. We're at home, we're starting to cook, and we start to think like, oh, I just don't feel right. I don't feel comfortable. I feel like I need to get back in my car and go back. And then what I always tell my clients is right there, that's the O, right? Like the obsessional component, where you're cooking, you're trying to move on, but there's just that nagging feeling. You feel dysregulated, you feel uncomfortable, you have thoughts about maybe I was hitting somebody, and that's the O. And then what happens is it turns into the C, which is the compulsion. And there's something that we call confirmation bias. And that's where you have a certain belief and you only seek out information to sort of confirm your belief. So we see that sometimes in, like, it can be sports, right? If you always think your team is the best in sports, you're always going to be looking like, oh, they traded this person, they're going to win this year, and all of that. And so in OCD, what happens is we use confirmation bias as well. And so if I'm that person, right, and I get home and I have that thought and I have that feeling that maybe I hit somebody with my car, OCD tricks us to think that we're going to take like a neutral, bipartisan sort of like objective assessment of the situation. But that's not what really happens. Our brain actually starts to use confirmation bias and go through information to build kind of like this belief system I always say like OCD is kind of lying to you, telling you a story, right? Builds this belief system around you hitting somebody with their car. So the way that that looks like is you're going to start to think and say, oh, well, I remember I got a call at one point and I didn't answer it, but I kind of looked at my phone. And then I was listening to the music louder than I normally did. And I sort of spaced out a little bit when I was driving. Ooh, that means that I could have hit someone. So it feels like that, compulsion right there is super objective, but it's not. It's confirmation bias. OCD is always going to collect data and facts that make you feel like you've done something. And so then we're going to come from that and say, oh my God, there is an opportunity that I hit someone. I should jump in my car and go back. So one thing that for everybody viewing this, one thing I want you to start looking at is when you get kind of hit with that thought and that feeling, anything after that, are you doing the treatment? Are you jumping in? So in this case, what that individual would say is they're like, look, I have OCD. I've been tricked by OCD before. I've been driving around the streets for hours and not seeing anybody. I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to finish my dinner. I'm going to eat. I'm going to have the rest of my evening. And I am not going to let myself go back out. And I will deal with that. Not that 100% certainty, right? Like I'm going to sit with some of that doubt. I'm pretty clear I didn't. I think I would know, but OCD always has us sort of questioning ourselves. So it's doing the response prevention. It's not going out and driving around, and it's really sticking to that. And what happens is as you kind of move forward, your anxiety goes down, you get out of that spiral, and then usually it's clearer, not always perfectly clear, but it's clearer that nothing really happened. So that's what I would strongly suggest is start to notice how your brain uses confirmation bias. Is it always saying things like, well, this could have happened, what if, things like that. Don't mistake that for facts, because in real life, you wouldn't do that. If you went and turned your car in to get it fixed and you were like, oh, did you guys fix my car? And they're like, we might have. You wouldn't take that for facts, right? You'd be like, did you fix it or did you not? So don't let OCD trick you in that way as well. So hopefully that was a little bit helpful, but just always make sure that you guys are checking out that confirmation bias. So OCD is always going to collect data to prove itself right. And sometimes that data is really crummy and wouldn't hold up in court, but it feels so real. And then we make the mistake in doing compulsions. And then we think compulsions is going to push it away. But instead, what compulsions really do is it makes it more likely that we are going to do it. It reinforces it and makes it feel more intense. So don't fall for that at all. I'm going to do a first question live, and that's from Lainey Gleiser. That's at 9:09 my time. So 12:09 your time, Amanda. It says, my 16-year-old daughter did the Bergen method. She's so much better, but not 100%. What does recovery actually look like? She still has intrusive thoughts. Well, first of all, I'm so glad she got treatment. I don't know. I know the Bergen method was in Texas, I believe, for a while. I don't know if that's where your daughter did it or if she did it somewhere else. But for those that aren't familiar, the Bergen method is like a very intensive all-day treatment, which is awesome in the sense that somebody gets to really like live the OCD treatment. Because a lot of times we haven't lived in a treatment lifestyle in a very long time. Our lives look a lot like compulsions. And so in this situation, with your daughter, I believe it's Texas, Lainey confirmed. So about I think it's 4 days, but it's an all day pretty much intensive treatment where you sort of live the treatment. So if you're somebody who has, religious scrupulosity, I mean, that day you might not do any kind of compulsions around praying. You might go to church if that's a trigger for you. So things like that, where you're just spending all day like that. I know a lot of places have intensives or partial hospitals. So I think the Bergen method, I don't know how many hours a day. So to answer your question, what does recovery look like? So I think of any kind of intensive. So I run an intensive that's 3 hours a day, any kind of partial hospital that's 6 hours a day, or a residential where you're there all day. What you're really learning is that the learning is happening, so much invaluable learning. So your daughter in this case, she learned what OCD is. She understands the OCD cycle. She understands how the OCD tricks her. Like she got a really good crash course in OCD. And then she learned about the treatment. And then after learning about the treatment, she didn't just learn about the treatment, she lived the treatment. And she got a glimpse of what her life would look like without OCD per se, or at least not giving into the OCD. So when people have done these kind of more intensive or higher level of care, they're actually waking up each day and living the treatment, what their life would look like if they dropped all of their compulsions. And what happens is when people do that, days back to back to back, what ends up happening is they start to realize that all of the lies that OCD said would happen, all of the negative outcomes, etc., doesn't happen, just doesn't happen. And they learn that they can trust themselves. They can learn that OCD lies. So they get some good information. The way that I explain this to you, Lainey, is it's sort of like somebody who goes to a boot camp for fitness. Let's say they're starting to become pre-diabetic and really need to get their health intact. They might go to a more crash course boot camp where they learn about nutrition, they learn about proper caloric intake and food sizes and get exercise going. But you would then never think that you get to go home and not exercise anymore. You would just come up with a weekly exercise plan, and then it becomes sort of second nature. You go to the gym, you go hiking on the weekends, you go boating, you make certain choices around food that's not super strict, obviously, but you're watching your intake of salts and other food that led you down an unhealthy path. And then sort of you forget that you're like exercising and eating well. It just becomes a lifestyle. So for instance, myself, Lainey, the way that I always say recovery looks like, recovery gets to a point where your decisions are no longer made by OCD. You're just in like a really, really good place where every day you wake up and you do whatever the heck you want. And OCD doesn't have a part in it. I would say for me personally, I would say after I was completed with treatment, it took about 2 to 3 years to not really have intrusive thoughts. Now that sounds horrid, right? Like, oh my God, 2 years, 3 years. But I'm telling you, like once I was done with treatment, probably like your daughter, my life was completely different. I went from being housebound and non-functioning, suicidal, like all the just the lowest of the lows, to like once I left treatment, I was volunteering at an animal shelter. I was doing tennis, martial arts. I was learning Spanish out of class. I started to leave the house during the day. My sleep schedule became normal. I eventually got a job and went back to school. So while I was doing those things and getting out there and no longer avoiding, new thoughts, feelings, and sensations came up. But the problem is that, but the good thing was I didn't look at that as a problem. I was like, okay, this is an opportunity to use my tools. And the more and more that I use my tools, I started to see that the work that I did in therapy totally translates to the real world. Because I'm guessing your daughter now is living a lifestyle she wasn't living pre-treatment, right? Pre-treatment, there's probably a lot of avoidance. So as she goes back to school and hangs out with friends and travels and does all the things she's doing now, my guess is new stuff kind of comes up. So don't be discouraged. That's normal. It's just using the tools. Now, the good thing is, like I said, where I'm at in my recovery, I get asked this all the time. Do I still have intrusive thoughts? I had harm thoughts about hurting family members. I had harm thoughts about hurting strangers. I had sexual intrusive thoughts. I had moral scrupulosity. I had all these different subtypes, and they were never really me. They were a disorder. They weren't aligned with me. So after a couple of years of really doing the treatment, those faded and I don't get them anymore. I'm around family all the time and strangers, and those thoughts don't even pop up. The only subtype that stuck around a little bit is perfectionism. I just tend to be somebody that likes to do things well and do things right. So I think there was a little my own personality there that OCD took and took it to an extreme, but I'm able to control that. And when I need to be, I run a lot of events through OCD SoCal and help with IOCDF. So when I'm doing those events, I want them to go well, et cetera, but I don't let it cross a line to perfectionism where I can't function. Instead, it's sort of like I'm able to cap it when it becomes unhealthy and OCD. So tell your daughter to hang in there. She learned a lot of great tools in treatment. She's just got to keep doing it and keep pushing herself. And once again, just like my workout example, it becomes a lifestyle. And then she doesn't feel like she's doing treatment. And then her intrusive thoughts, it becomes easier and easier to separate herself from them and not really give them any energy. Because remember, once that thought pops up, if she quickly dismisses it, great. If instead she sits there and tries to figure it out or answer it or ruminate on it, that's when it becomes a problem. So over time, that will absolutely start to help it fade. So hopefully that was helpful. OCD Crusher, you said great explanation, confirmation bias. Yes, start to be very curious about the way that OCD uses that. It uses it a lot. So for instance, like if I believe, like I thought LA was dirty. Now, those of you who are out in California might say some parts of LA are, but the OCD was holistic and thought all of LA was dirty. And so when I would go to LA, when I had to go to LA, not had to go, but when I went to LA for treatment, because my treatment was there, I was in Westwood, one of the nicest areas in LA. But instead of being neutral and observant and realizing like, wow, this is a really beautiful part of the city, my brain went straight to like, I think there's smog. What's that on the ground? Like I searched out things to convince myself that LA was dirty so that I could do compulsions, not willingly, obviously, and not consciously, but that's how OCD tricks you. So start to notice, like, the OCD is going to have you scan and almost argue for it as why the compulsions are helpful. For No More at 1214 on YouTube asked, what should OCD treatment include and in what proportion? So medicine or therapy. So what I usually as a clinician will say is, if you are a more mild case or like lower on the moderate and you don't want to go on medication right out the gate, some people do. And there is nothing wrong with medication. I went on medication for my treatment. I'm no longer on medication, but I went on it because I needed it. I hit sort of like a plateau in my treatment 6 months in and needed it. So when I'm working with clients, if clients come in and say, look, I'm not seeing a psychiatrist, and we do a Y box, which is a clinical assessment tool to let us know about what is the what is the level of severity for OCD. And let's say somebody comes back pretty mild or lower on the moderate and they don't want to go on medication. What I'll say is, like, let's give the treatment a try. Let's really dig into the treatment, which is going to be primarily exposure response prevention. We're going to add in motivational interviewing if they need to kind of find and understand why they're doing the treatment. We're going to add acceptance and commitment therapy so they can understand the goals and the reasons that they're doing it. We might use some CBT, some cognitive behavioral therapy, especially if there's a really deep belief in thoughts. But there's a lot of different treatment methods. We can add group, we can step up before someone needs to go on medication. But once again, if somebody wants to go on medication, I never stop them because I don't have the like negative belief or stigma that I think sometimes society has on medication. So let's say then we go ahead and we go on to treatment. If that person does well, they manage their symptoms, we start to space out treatment and they go on their way without medication, awesome. Now, if somebody is more moderate, kind of up there on moderate, severe, especially in the extreme range on the Y box, I will have a conversation and I'll say, look, even if you're not wanting to do medication, what about just doing an assessment with a psychiatrist and just seeing what the psychiatrist thinks? And you can always get the prescription and not start it. And then we can do the treatment. And if, like me, you hit a plateau or the anxiety is too difficult to face the OCD at all, then we can talk about going on that medication. So when the BTTI, which is a training institute under Eric Storch and Alec Pollard through the IOCDF, when we were there in San Diego at the training, they were talking about, what the research shows is, out of anything, the therapy is really key. But people do find a lot of recovery if they do both the therapy and the medication. So I think it comes back down to, are you finding just too difficult to face the OCD? Is the thoughts too intense and too frequent? Is the anxiety too intense? Are you finding yourself really struggling with depression? I know for me, the medication helped with my panic attacks, depression, and anxiety. So it made it a lot easier to focus on the OCD. But if you do take medication, you always got to do therapy. That's how the medication works. It helps you do the therapy. So I would say even psychiatrists agree that the predominant treatment is the exposure response prevention, the behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. So make sure to primarily do that. And then if you need medication, it can be an adjunct. So hopefully that helps. All right, Lola says at 12:16, I've been able to get through recovery, at least an ongoing journey towards recovery with the CBT and ERP, but my therapist also suggested medication, but I wonder if I really need it. Is it necessary? So I kind of answered this, but I'll go into it even a little bit deeper. So in this case, what I would ask yourself, Lola, is if you've done really well in treatment, are you living the way you want to live? Are you waking up each day and you're in a good mental space and you're kind of kicking butt and you're proud of yourself and you're doing all the goals that you want? Maybe you don't need medication. I would wonder what your therapist, because your therapist knows you a lot better than I do. So I would ask your therapist, what do they see that they think maybe I need medication for? I know for me, like I said, when I'm working with a client and they're putting in a lot of work, but they're not getting the level of relief that I know they could get, that I've seen in myself and I've seen in other people, that's when I suggest it. I say, look, have you thought about medication? Now, your therapist and myself are not psychiatrists, so we're never going to push it to the sense of like it's clinically necessary, but we'll really strongly recommend somebody go through it if they're hitting a plateau. And that might be what your therapist thinks, is that you've hit a plateau and you're you've been able to get through, and she thinks or he thinks maybe you can go a little bit further. Maybe you can drop in the chat, Lola, what was there a specific reason that your therapist suggested it? Like I said, if I have a client that's done really, really well on it, sometimes what happens is a client will do really well in treatment, but they're really struggling after treatment to transition back into everyday life. They have a lot of anxiety, they have a lot of depression from being out of life for so long because of the OCD. And sometimes medication can kind of help with that transition period. So if you're open to it, maybe put in the chat why you think that your therapist suggested it. But always remember, the psychiatrist isn't going to force you to take medication. So sometimes just seeing it, asking them like, what extra level of relief based on what I have right now, what do they see for me? Do they see something that the medication is going to help with that maybe you've stalled out on? So hopefully that helps. All right, Mariella says, hi from Argentina. What are you saying is so true. I'm starting to realize all the OCD lies to me. Also, it's like the day is so much longer now that I'm not compulsing 24/7. Yes, I love comments like that. So I'll break it down in two. The first one is, I am promising everybody on the other side of this camera that OCD will never tell you the truth. I've worked in the OCD and mental health space since 2009. I have never once had clients come in and be like, oh, the OCD told me a bunch of truths. It's always lies, right? It's always dramatic. Everything's dangerous, right? Like if you have contamination, everything is dirty, everything has mold, everything has germs, everything has dirt. If you have moral scrupulosity, everything you do is bad. Every thought you have is bad. If you're hit and run, every time you drive, you're hitting people. Every drive, you're a bad person. You don't know how to drive. You're reckless. If you have checking, you're always leaving things behind. Like everything is always dangerous. And then what you can probably understand, Mariella, is it's not just that it's dangerous, the outcome is always the worst. God is going to be mad at you. You're going to go to hell forever. You're going to kill people. You're going to go to prison. You're going to all these things. And it's like, man, that doesn't happen to people in real life. It's always so dramatic for OCD. Everything is so over the top. And you start to learn that it just lies. I can say that if I went back in time and I dropped all my compulsions in a day, which would have been way impossible to do, but let's say I did, nothing bad would have happened to me. Everything OCD is telling you is a lie. Now, does that mean bad things don't happen? Sure, they do. Earthquakes do happen, right? Car accidents happen. Sometimes we do hurt somebody's feeling. Sometimes we do bump into somebody, or we're playing a sport and we hurt somebody because we tackled them too hard. I mean, I can't promise you that things don't happen, but what I can promise you is that you'll be able to handle it. You'll be able to figure it out. You'll be able to take care of it. And it's not going to be as catastrophic as OCD says. And that's the funny thing too, Mariella, as you get better, like you said in that second part, is that suddenly you're like, wow, now that just like getting ready in the morning isn't an event, or going to church is actually a pleasurable experience, not horrible. Or like you said, if your OCD is much more about mental obsessions and compulsions, and you're just like, wow, now that I'm not compulsing mentally all day, I can focus. You suddenly do have a longer day. And I always joke with my clients, I'm always like, people in our lives that don't have OCD, they should be able to like build cities and be CEOs, because you're just like that. There's so much more time in the day for them than us. So yeah, definitely. All right, so Matt at 1223 says, what would be a good way to reduce the fight, flight, fright response with ERP so it's not too overwhelming? So the thing that you always have to remember is, I like to think about it as like we almost have like two brains, right? We have like our rational cognitive brain that I'm using while I speak to you guys right now, and you're using to write and to type. And we have that fight, flight, freeze, fright brain. We think of it as like the primitive or the reptilian brain that jumps in when we're in danger. Now, it's a great system. We want that part of the brain, because if I'm driving and a car almost hits me, I want my brain to quickly jump into that fight, flight, or freeze and be able to like quickly, without a lot of thinking, grab my steering wheel, swerve out of the way, pull over to safety and cool down, and then get back on the road. Maybe be a little shaky at first. Maybe I pull over to go to the bathroom or something, and then I get on the road, turn on some air conditioning, play some music, and I'm on my way, and I'm cool and calm and can focus on driving. That's what the experience is supposed to be, is these quick jump into fight or flight mode to get us to safety and then quickly go back down to calm. But as you all know watching this, that's not how OCD works. OCD puts us in that fight or flight consistently, multiple times a day, and around non-threatening objects or around situations that haven't occurred yet, that or they happened in the past and not right now. Because remember, the power is in the present. We can't fix things in the past. We can't fix things from happening in the future. We can totally focus on what's happening right now. And so that's why other people don't jump in their fight or flight all the time. Now, what happens with exposure response prevention is you're asking yourself to put yourself in situations that cause distress. One thing that I really, really take from ACT and values work is I don't put my clients in like a fear factor boot camp type of treatment. I don't find it necessary. So if a client doesn't like public restrooms, I find that using a public restroom is usually enough. They don't have to lick toilets. I don't do any of that crap, right? But using a public restroom may cause somebody with some anxiety to go into their fight or flight. So we have an option. We could either avoid public restrooms for life. And if you do that, you know it's not sustainable. You can't travel. You can't be out all day. You always have to like be by your house so you can race home to use your restroom. So it's helping somebody see the value in going into a public restroom and using it. But Matt, to make sure that learning happens, because I want people to learn from the exposure, they can't be in terror mode. So if they haven't used a public restroom in 5 years, it makes no sense that the first time we go to an outhouse and they use that and it's gross and they're touching things, right? That's going to be too overwhelming to the system. So I happen to work next to a really nice mall called South Coast Plaza. And so there are bathrooms in there. And the bathrooms in our office, you have to have like a key and a code. It's like really clean, right? So for most of my clients, that bathroom is almost probably cleaner than their bathroom at home. I know it's cleaner than my bathroom. So we'll start there. And sometimes it's just simply walking in next to the sinks, looking at the bathroom and just sitting there for 30 seconds and then walking back out. So what I'm saying, Matt, is when it's collaborative, when you see value in it, when it makes sense to you, and when you do it at a small scale, what happens is the person says, okay, I can walk into the bathroom at your office. Maybe the next session, we walk into the bathroom and we stand next to the urinal. Maybe the next session they use it, so you can move up slowly like that. And then sometimes you'll surprise yourself. You'll go in there and be like, oh, this doesn't feel that bad. That anticipatory anxiety built up a story that really freaked me out. But now that I'm standing here and my imagination can't go crazy and I can look around and there's not really anything occurring, the bathroom's kind of clean and it's a little bit boring. I expected it to be much scarier. I'm willing to push myself and try. So make sure you're biting off exposures that you can chew. The most important thing, in my opinion, based off of the work that I've read from John Abramowitz, who will be leading the research roundtable next week, inhibitory learning is where our brain starts to learn from exposures and make new belief systems around what used to be dirty or used to be sinful or whatever if it's taboo thoughts used to be harmful, right? And what happens from that learning is now when I go in the bathroom the next time, I have a understanding that it's not as bad as I thought, but that learning has to happen. It doesn't happen in terror. So we want to make sure that we're biting it off as much as we can chew. Lastly, always remember that feelings are temporary. They're temporary experiences. So if you're going into that bathroom in my analogy or my example and you're feeling some anxiety, remind yourself that it's a temporary experience. I can't tell you when it's going to fade, but it's not going to be with you forever. That's one of those OCD lies. So thankfully that's helpful. Hi, Leanne said howdy. So it's good to see you. So good to have you here as well. Lola, you said there wasn't a specific reason that we talked about medication. It was more a suggestion. I wanted more relief or maybe faster recovery. I feel like I've progressed a ton with the therapy itself. Yeah, I mean, Lola, I have clients that even are extremely severe, but they just really pick up on the treatment super, super well. And, they don't ever need medication. I mean, they're really severe cases and they just don't need it. So what I would say is maybe have a new conversation with your therapist if that original conversation was a little bit back then, or if you're not seeing your therapist anymore, maybe because you're doing so well, that's its answer in itself. But I know, like, I've suggested medication to clients before because they were severe. And I said, just kind of keep it on the table. And then they've done really well. And then they've asked me, they said, hey, I know at the start of our care, you had recommended medication. And I'll say to them, like, you're doing really well without it. You're doing really, really well without it. Maybe you can kind of keep going, maybe getting back into some things that you've avoided because of the OCD. And then let's see if you need it. But it sounds like you don't. So that's an option. If you're doing really, really great and you progressed great, you may not need medication. There's so many people that get better without it. I did need medication. I did really well in treatment, but about 6 months in, I hit a plateau. And it was just like no matter what we did, I wasn't getting the same relief. And it felt hard. And my therapist suggested psychiatrist. So I went, I did an assessment and talked to him and just felt really comfortable and went on medication. And it helped me sort of like push through the final stuff with my OCD. And then I stayed on it for about a couple years after. And then I started going to my psychiatry appointments and having nothing to talk about. And it was kind of awkward because it's like, oh my God, we still have like 20 minutes to fill and I don't have anything to say. So that's when we tapered down slowly, and I've been off ever since. But so I was like over a decade ago. But I always tell people if I needed to go back on medication, I would. I don't think medication is necessarily a bad thing. I think sometimes people just would rather not be on anything. It's not necessarily, medication for OCD. Sometimes people would rather not have to take Advil or whatever it is. But if it's needed, definitely taking it. Yes, Leanne. Leanne says everything that OCD is telling is a lie. I agree with you. I always tell people OCD is a liar. OCD either makes something up that's just not plausible or not true, or it takes a situation that's manageable and blows it out of proportion. So let's say, for instance, like a lot of people with OCD have a really hard time making a decision. So I have a lot of clients right now that are deciding what college to go to. Or I had a client who had two friends invite him to a wedding at the same time and same day, and they got the invitations at the same time as well. And they're like, I'll never be able to go to both. They're on the different sides of the coast. I'm a bad person. Their brain went spiraling. Or a lot of clients are like, I'm going to pick the wrong college and I'll never be happy. And it's like, that's a lie. You'll figure it out. Is it ideal? No, but it's manageable, right? Like whatever college you end up going to, you're going to get an experience. It's going to be great, and you can always leave. Having two weddings, you choose who you're closest with, and the other person you send your regards, but you make it up to them. Maybe you go a day early and celebrate with them and fly to the other one. I mean, we can manage it. I think that's what OCD always does. It has us lose trust in ourselves. And I hope that what people get from the treatment is starting to trust themselves again, and start to believe that they can manage the OCD, manage their life, and not listen that it's going to be hard forever. Lola, you said at 12:29 about side effects. I will say medication does have side effects, so that's something to remember. Some people, like with Prozac for me, I had a side effect at first, and staying on the medication, the side effects faded. Some people don't have that. So that's why a psychiatrist care is important. I know we're going to have a psychiatrist on a live stream this month, I believe. Amanda knows the schedule better than I do by heart, but I think we asked a psychiatrist to come back. So we have a lot of medication questions. So I'll make sure that Liz and I announce when that psychiatrist is going to be on, because those are some good things to ask, because I know there's things that you can do around medication side effects. Sometimes switch medications or go lower dose. I know sometimes they'll recommend TMS or other things. So we'll have a psychiatrist on, and that way they can answer it. Betsy at 12:29 says OCD lies. We need to challenge it, not engage it. Yes. OCD is not your friend. Don't ever let OCD be your buddy. Betsy says it perfectly at 12:29. It's like OCD is not your friend. It's not there to help you. It's not there to enhance your life in any way. It really is trying to dominate your life. It's trying to make your life small. I want everyone to think like as OCD's impacted us, right? It gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I know for me, I was housebound. I didn't leave my house except one day a week to get necessities. And it was in the middle of the night at a 24-hour Ralph's by my house. But your life and world becomes smaller. And so engaging in OCD and acting like it's our friend and it's helpful and it's causing us to be safe and giving into it blindly has never been helpful for anyone. So it's really about challenging it, saying, no, okay, I'm making a change. I'm going to get into some treatment or go to live streams like this or go to a conference or start getting some support, some help. I'm going to start to pushing back against it. So OCD wants me to pray right now. I'm going to pray each morning and each night. That's what my church and I have done forever. I'm not going to pray just because OCD asked me, and I'm gonna just no, I refuse, right? So when we stop giving into OCD the way that it asks us to, you'll be surprised at how much it cowers. I think a lot of times people are intimidated by their OCD, but remember, it's not helpful, it's not real, so you can definitely push back. So that's kind of how I like to think of it, as that. So you're welcome, Matt. Moonchild at 12:34 says, I've heard that ERP can be a kind of compulsion. Is that true? So I think one of those things is people can definitely make the treatment a compulsion. Absolutely. Unfortunately, with OCD, we can make anything compulsive. I'm in a couple of therapy groups, and I know that NoCD put out like an ad about how napping can become a compulsion. And we definitely see that in depression. A lot of times people will oversleep, but sometimes in OCD as well, we can take napping as a compulsion. If we're dealing with intrusive thoughts or we're triggered and we don't want to deal with it, sometimes we nap to sort of escape. So absolutely, we can turn the treatment into compulsion. So the way that I see it a lot is when people are more focused on like how to do the treatment than doing it. So, I'll tell a client like, okay, um, you know, I want you to kind of dedicate maybe 30 minutes tonight to driving around your neighborhood, right? Like let's say that that's their exposure. They have hit and run OCD. And like they'll come in and they'll be like, I failed. And I'm like, what happened? They're like, I only did 25 minutes because I had to get home to cook. It needs to be 30 minutes. You said 30, so it needs to be 30. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. The time isn't really the focus. I want you to do it long enough that you experience some change and some learning and some habituation, all these other things that the treatment creates. But I want you to just do the treatment and learn. Don't be so particular. Sometimes if people have to fill out homework sheets or worksheets or things that I'm doing with them, they'll focus more on like how their writing looks or how they wrote it, or want to get a couple copies to throw it away and rewrite it nicely. Sometimes people will use imaginary scripts actually as a compulsion. So they'll write a narrative or a script, and then they'll learn like, okay, I'm supposed to read it, sort of recognize how it ends, not really challenge it, etc. But then they start reading it compulsively because they're like, oh, I got to read this. I got to read it. It's giving me relief. So I always tell people, ask yourself sort of the motive of why you're doing something. If you're doing ERP, here's an example. I had a client that had harm OCD. And so they avoided knives. So their treatment was to start to buy some knives, bring them back into the home. They like to cook steaks and other foods that they could use knives. And then they just did really well. And I was like, you're done with treatment. Awesome. We have nothing to talk about. Like, go live your life. And they came back a year later and they had relapsed a little bit. And I was confused because they did so well. Well, it turns out that after treatment, they were still doing exposures every day, but not in the sense of actually doing exposures to challenge, like living with knives and eating and things like that. What they were doing is they were using the ERP to check, okay, I have this knife. How do I feel? Do I feel like I want to hurt someone? That's not the treatment. That's a compulsion. They're checking. How do I feel? Do I have sensations? Does this knife make me want to hurt someone? So that is not the treatment. So yes, sometimes you can make the treatment into compulsive. So be open with your therapist about it. I'll say the good thing is it's not the most common thing. I'd say it's less common. But yeah, some clients use it as compulsions for checking and other things like that. So it's really like an example is people that might have pedophilia OCD. They'll find out that, okay, like an exposure I'll do with them is I'll say, okay, we're right near a park at my office. And I'll say, let's go to the park and just play basketball. There's a basketball court. It's right next to the playground. And let's just play basketball. And it might be the first time they're at a park, right? If they go back to their park on their own and they're checking their groinal response, they're checking how they feel, that's not an exposure. That's using an exposure as a compulsion to check how they feel, to try to get answers and try to get certainty. And so that's what you want to make sure that you don't do. Yes, thoughts are temporary and feelings are temporary. So don't ever let OCD tell you otherwise. It's good to see Miss Val Andrews, and hi, Dave, as well. It's good to see Dave and Val. So Val is a lead IOCDF advocate. So it's always good to see her. I absolutely love Val. Matt says, I've become really passionate supporting people with OCD. What are good courses to train in CBT and peer support? So good question, Matt. So if people aren't familiar with peer support is something where an individual with lived experience can get some training to support or help people out. So sometimes we see that where somebody might be seeing a licensed therapist like myself, but want some peer support. I happen to have OCD, so usually I can provide that, but there's a lot of therapists that don't. And so sometimes they want to work with somebody who, can offer peer support. I would say training in CBT. I mean, CBT is really a therapy treatment model. And I don't know how it works in the UK, but here in the United States, for someone to be utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy, they really should go back to school and become a licensed clinician, or at least be a student who's learning CBT and eventually will become licensed, because that's really like a treatment modality. There's a lot of training in that. But for instance, at OCD SoCal, one of our board members, Shannon Switzer, is a person with lived experience, and she's a peer support specialist through NAMI, which is the National Alliance in Mental Illness here in the United States. I don't know if NAMI is international, but she got trained through NAMI on how to be a peer support specialist. So she works through NAMI as somebody with lived experience that offers support, validation, resources for individuals looking for it. Chrissy Hodges, who's out in Colorado, is a certified peer support specialist. Her state has some really advanced trainings and allows people to be peer support and work in hospitals and offer resources and support for people. So I always think Chrissy Hodgins is a good person, or Shannon Switzer on our board. So if you go to ocdsocal.org, you can definitely email us and we can get it to Shannon. So there are some good courses that different organizations offer. I believe Shannon Shai, who's a former IOCDF president of the board and a peer support specialist, he is developing a training system. So he is on the East Coast. So definitely look up Shannon Shai as well. So those are a couple people that can help. Now you can learn about CBT. I don't think it's a bad thing to learn about. I think it's so helpful, not only in OCD. And if you're not familiar, ERP is a type of CBT specifically for OCD, but CBT can also help with all different things. We use it for eating disorders. We use it for depression, etc. So there are some good courses. Most courses, you have to be a trained professional. But if you come to any of the IOCDF conferences, even if the talk is aimed at clinicians, you can sit in on it as a person with OCD, and there's some training there. And then there's some really good books and manuals on CBT. So there's a lot of stuff on CBT. So you'll definitely be able to find that. Isabel at 1240 says, "Oh, you are so incredible. Thank you. Relatable and hopeful. I wish I had the ability and resources to see you personally. I really need help with OCD, but therapy is too expensive. Is there any way to really get better on your own?" So Isabel, first of all, thank you for your kind words. I always am like super honored and humbled when people say kind things. So I really, really appreciate it. So there's a couple things. There's the OCD challenge. Let me double check the website and make sure before I just say it without, yeah. So it's OCD challenge. So it's ocdchallenge.com. And I believe Liz was the one who usually is my co-host, was the one who's really behind it. So the OCD challenge offers a lot of resources that you can do for yourself. There's also the OCD workbook. Once again, let me look up who wrote it, which is horrible. I have it at my office. I'm normally at my office and I just don't have it in front of me. But the OCD workbook by Bruce Hyman, who's passed away. I found out he passed, which is really sad, but a lot of people loved him in the community. But it's called the OCD workbook by Bruce Hyman. And that's a really good self-help book as well. And so what you can do, Isabel, is some people will do OCD challenge. They'll do the OCD workbooks. I know John Hirschfield, who was on last week, has written some really good OCD workbooks. And so really utilizing that. A couple other thoughts is, like, I know NoCD takes insurance and has low cost. I know, like, my center is in contract with Kaiser. Jenny Yip's center, the Renewed Freedom Center, does sliding scale and really low cost. USC works with the LAC, it's the LA hospital, and takes Medicare and Medi-Cal. And Barbara Van Oppen, if you emailed if you emailed either the IOCDF or OCD SoCal, we could get you to Barbara, but I know they take Medi-Cal and Medicare. And then I think UCLA takes insurance and stuff. So there's definitely some things out there. If you want to, there's a recent live stream that we did. It was Liz, myself, and it was Fred Penzel. And he talked about how to navigate treatment through insurance and low cost options as well. So it's a really good live stream to watch, and that gives a lot of different resources. But what I will say is there have been people that have gone on medication and they've done those workbooks, and they've done come to live streams or low cost conferences and really helped themselves get better. So come to these live streams. Anything that we can do to support you, Isabel, we're always here. So hopefully that's definitely hopeful. Yes, Lola, we're going to have a psychiatrist. Matt, so I don't personally do virtual treatment worldwide. I'm licensed with California. The nice thing is, because of the pandemic, some states I'm able to get an easy license or a temporary license or work with people for a certain amount of sessions. So it just depends on the state. I know you're in the UK. Stuart Ralph, who is the host of OCD Stories, is out in the UK, and he's a clinician now. So he'd be a good person to talk to. But I am going to look into it because some countries, as long as we have international insurance, it seems like we could work with them. So TBA. But I will say that Stuart Ralph is great and has a lot of great resources out there. Yeah, so Leanne puts in the chat at 12:45, NAMI's Peer-to-Peer is a free 8-session educational program for adults with mental health conditions who are looking to better understand themselves and their recovery. Yes, and then I believe Shannon would be the one to contact. I believe then Shannon, then you can take additional training so that you can then turn around and help others as peer support. So that might be great, Matt. And Val, yes, good point. So Val in the chat at 12:48 makes a really, really good point. Support group. So I would say, like, I run a free family and loved one support group, Isabel. So if you email me, I'll put my email in the chat. Let's see, so that Amanda can put it. If you email me, I can get you on our mailing list. So we have a free, actually it's this Saturday from 11 to 1. So it's for individuals with OCD, their families and loved ones. We can get you on the mailing list for that. I know my clinic runs low cost support groups. I know a lot of clinics will run low ones. Some are free. So that can help people to get some help. Okay, so April 19th. So next Wednesday is going to be Research Roundtable with Kyle and John Abramowitz. And then the following week, which is April 19th. So Steve Poskar, who's a psychiatrist, will be back with us answering your medication questions. So if you have medication questions, please come back. They can definitely offer, Steve can definitely answer any questions. So not next week, still come for Research Roundtable, but the Wednesday after that, we can definitely get your medication questions answered. Yes, so John has a workbook on ACT. And also John has a book on mindfulness and OCD. So there's definitely some really, really good different things there. I know Leanne put it in there. Yeah, so Isabel, how would we find out if you are licensed to do virtual treatment in our area? So I think the best thing to do is I put my email on the screen. You could reach out to me personally, but let's say you find a clinician that you like and they happen to not be in your state. What I would do is I'd email their office and just say, look, are you able to see clients in this state? I know for psychologists, there's an agreement with, I believe it's 35 states or so where they can work interstate. I know for us licensed therapists, like we can work in some states, so definitely reach out. And then how do you find out if treatment is covered by insurance? Same thing, reach out to the clinic. So we're in network with Kaiser. Like I said, there's a lot of therapists that might be in network with certain treatment providers. NoCD has certain insurances they take. So the best thing that you can do is to call to reach out to an office. And then what they'll be able to do is, I know sometimes we'll be able to run insurance and give people what their specific benefits are. So I would just reach out. It's not a waste of time. You know, sometimes people will say like they found a therapist they love in New York and they're in Florida and they want to work with that therapist in New York. And then they reach out and find out that the therapist either is licensed in Florida too, or Florida, I believe is one of the states where we can get temporary licenses really easily. So they might apply for that so they can work with you. There's different things. So don't count people out. It's a very different world after the pandemic for therapy than it used to be pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, it was pretty much, since we saw everybody in person, you kind of had to be in that actual state. So there's a lot of different things that have changed because of the pandemic. Amanda, I'm going to put one of the questions that we got in the private chat. So this was a question we got pre-submitted, and it says, how do I deal with false memories related to pedophilia OCD? How much I ruminate, I do not get the answer. What I want to say, and the reason I wanted to answer this question, is the way that I look at OCD is like, pedophilia, obviously in real life, is terrible, right? But pedophilia OCD is a very different thing, and it's often really misunderstood, sometimes even in our OCD community, but out there in the real world as well. So anytime somebody has any kind of harm OCD or sexual OCD, it's where their brain is bringing up thoughts and images that feel real, And then we misread those images and those thoughts and feelings as like, is this something I want? Is this something I care about? Oh my God, like, am I this? Am I that? Every client I've ever had that has pedophilia OCD are some of the nicest, kindest people who love children and would never do anything bad. And so what you want to recognize is if you have this thought, I know sometimes it can be stigmatizing, it can feel horrible, and it can feel like you're a bad person, but it's not you, it's the disorder. So never own that. In this case, so when we have false memory OCD, typically it's years back. It's never like last week, right? It's from years, and from years ago. And what happens is the brain puts a what if question. What if that one day you got too close to a kid? What if you liked when your niece sat on your lap? Like, it brings up a question. And because it's so many years ago, we don't remember the incident. That at the time, the incident was a non-event, because we know with OCD, nothing's ever real, right? So nothing happened back then. But your brain is trying to like make an issue where one doesn't exist. The mistake people will make with this subtype is then they'll start asking that question, and they'll start to travel back in time and try to replay that day. Or if it's not really about a real event, it's just like, could I have back in the day? I remember being around my niece and nephews. Could I have done that? The problem is because you didn't, it wasn't an event, right? Or else you would have remembered it the day of. And now it's all these years later. The mistake that we make is the rumination. We travel back in time mentally. We try to replay the situations, the days, the events leading up to it, all of that, to get answers. Now, going back to my original conversation with confirmation bias, you're not visiting that time neutral and taking neutral information to make a final conclusion. Your brain is going to try to convince you you've done something. It's going to say, well, you've been around children, or you had feelings about children, or there's pedophiles out there. It's going to use kind of disjointed facts and build a story that you're going to buy into, and then think, oh my God, I did it. So when somebody comes in with a subtype, the first thing that I ask them is, what are the compulsions they're doing? Typically, once again, it's mental compulsion. It's the rumination. It's the time traveling. It's trying to figure it out. And that's the problem. There isn't a real issue there, except that every time you ruminate, it's like making a photocopy of a photocopy. The memory becomes more blurry, and then you're less sure about what happened. So what we have to make sure that we do in that moment is we say, okay, I need to get to clarity. I need to get to a point where I'm not so anxious and I'm not so triggered, and I need to calm down. And the only way I can do that is through response prevention. Now, an exposure would be if there is something that, like, let's say you've been avoiding a certain situation, go there. It brings up the thoughts on your own time. The narrative or the imaginal script, right, is going to bring up thoughts. Or if the thoughts are already coming on their own, you might spend more time on response prevention. So anytime your thought goes back in the past, because that's what you're learning, the more you ruminate, you don't get the answer. And I would argue the more you ruminate, the less you trust your memories, the less you trust yourself, and the more likely you're going to believe it. So how do we stop rumination, right? What we do in that moment is we say, okay, I am not going to try to figure out this answer. I'm just not. The answer is not there. It never will be there. And I'm not going to try to figure it out. Now, OCD is going to tell you by not trying to figure it out, it means that you're okay with pedophilia, or you're okay with that action. Don't fall for it. You're simply saying, I'm not going to ruminate. I'm going to focus on what I'm doing now. I'm going to focus on the near future, like what I have to do later today. And anytime I feel my brain trying to go back, I'm recognizing that I'm taking myself out of right now and I'm going back. And that's where OCD lives for me with this subtype. So I'm going to own and accept that I'm not going to be certain in the way that OCD wants, but I'm going to just be okay with not knowing. And that's what's really underneath it. Not necessarily the pedophilia. It's using that to trick you, but it's that uncertainty, that not knowing feeling that you're experiencing. Embrace that. That's the treatment. It's really saying, I don't want the answer. I'm going to sit without the answer, and I'm going to move forward. What usually happens when clients do that, additionally with some exposures with the scripts, or in this case with pedophilia OCD, maybe they go back and visit their niece or their nephew or whatever it is, over time, because they're not ruminating, they're not reinforcing the OCD cycle, and then their memory becomes much more clear, and they're like, I'd never do that. But you got to get there by doing the work. All right, I'm going to try to answer the last two live questions. I know we have like a minute. Gina at 1254 says, how do you get help for your kid who is a regular hospital ER behavioral unit when, despite all our efforts, they don't address the OCD nor know how to, and continue to trigger her with their ignorance? So Gina, this happens a lot. A lot of treatment centers out there, people will go to, like a kid or an adult, because they are like depressed, suicidal, self-harming. And so I always think of a hospital or a behavioral unit as like only there for safety. It's to make sure that your loved one isn't around anything they could hurt themselves with. It's to stabilize medication. It's to get them on kind of like a solid track, a solid ground, so that they then can do, then they can do something to get better. So what we have to do in that moment is realize, Gina, like the ER or the behavioral unit is strictly just to help your daughter be stabilized. What you want to realize is a lot of people that don't treat OCD are going to trigger her OCD because they don't understand it. They're not trained to treat OCD. So what we want to do in this situation is if she needs something that level of care, like a hospital or a residential, if you go on the iocdf.org/find-help, under options, you can put residential treatment, you can put partial hospital, you can put intensive outpatient, and it'll show those programs around you, or at least in the states closest to you. And that's what I would strongly suggest, is getting her on a waiting list for a residential treatment center. Liz isn't here this week, but she runs one in Texas. I don't know, you said kids, so typically that's under 18. I believe Liz is 18 and up, but the one in Boston or the one through McLean or Rogers in Wisconsin are for under 18. I think there's a center in Utah as well, but there's a lot of partial hospitals that see kids in states, and a lot of intensives. So think of the hospital as really just there to sort of keep her stable, and then to find a treatment center that specializes in OCD. If she has an outpatient therapist that works with OCD, I have before where I've had a client have to go to the hospital. What I'll do is I'll connect with the hospital and just sort of see what are they doing. Are they doing things that are helpful or not helpful, and sort of coach or guide them why they're in the hospital so that it doesn't over trigger them. But you really want to find a treatment center that specializes in that. I know out here sometimes hospitals will have like an IOP for depression or anxiety. That's not helpful for OCD. But if my client is dealing with depression and anxiety and needs stabilization, that might be a good step until they get into OCD treatment. And then Matt, I'm going to answer your question lastly, quickly. So how do you approach somatic OCD with treatment at 1254? So if you're talking about somatic, like where you fixate on your breathing, on your blinking, on swallowing, kind of like those basic functions, sometimes it's the way things feel. The mistake everybody makes is they want that feeling, that they want that hyperfixation to go away. They don't want to focus on it. They don't want to zone in on their blinking. Sometimes the fear is, if I don't focus on my blinking, I'll blink incorrectly or I'll stop breathing. So sometimes that's the core fear. Or the core fear might just simply be, I'm going to have this feeling and experience forever. So what we want to do exposure-wise, always think of like opposite action. So what I'll tell clients is, let's purposely sit here. If your core fear is more that you're going to notice it forever, I'll say, let's sit in session and let's just focus on our blinking for 20 minutes together. What happens, because they're deliberately doing it, it becomes really boring. And so that fright and that anxiety and, oh my God, I'm going to think about it forever, you're facing that. And it's like, okay, we're doing that. Let's just do it for 20 minutes. What happens? I do this with clients all the time. After about 3 minutes, they're like, Chris, I'm really bored. I'm like, nope, we're doing it 17 more minutes. And after that, they realize like, okay, it was inconvenient and it was undesirable, but it wasn't like as bad as I thought. And then because that panic is gone, when they're out in the real world and they start to notice they're blinking, it's like, okay, I'm noticing my blinking. It's undesirable and irritable, but it's not the end of the world. And then because that's boring and the brain realizes it's not that exciting, it stops focusing on it and focuses on other things. Now, if the core fear instead is that if I don't focus on my breathing, I'm going to breathe incorrectly and kind of gasp for air or stop breathing correctly, then the treatment's a little bit different because the core fear is different. So what I do with a client on that is I might take them across the street to a store. We'll go around shopping and I tell them, I want you to focus on the shopping experience and conversation with me and not your breathing, and tolerate the uncertainty that you may stop breathing. Let's test it out. Let's write a script if you're too scared to try it out, and let's see what the script says. Let's kind of read that and start to habituate to some of that fear. And then when we go across the street and they're sort of paying attention to me, they'll notice like, oh, I didn't pay attention to my breathing for like 5 minutes, and I absolutely didn't have any choking fits. So they learn that the OCD once again is lying. So hopefully that's helpful. Really quick, 1201, Leanne, you said, how frequent should exposures be done? Every day, once a week as needed. When you're in the beginning of treatment, I always suggest to set aside about an hour a day. Now that's a lot of time, so make your exposures part of everyday functioning. If it's around knives in the kitchen, go to a restaurant and order breakfast that uses a knife. Use the knives in your kitchen for dinner. Like, make sure that you're using knives every day. Try to find a way to make the treatment around something you already do and something you value, and then it's a lot easier to keep that up. As you get further along with treatment, like I was saying earlier, exposures just become part of everyday functioning. So if I was out eating, I'd purposely eat something with my hands because that triggered the contamination. So it's to add that in and sort of just make it a lifestyle. But you got to be consistent. What I'll end with is we definitely find time in the day to do compulsions. So we got to be able to find time in the day to do exposures. All right, I think I got to every single question. Thank you so much for all the kind words in the chat. They do not go unnoticed. Thank you, Val. Thank you, Amy, Lee Ann. You're so sweet. Thank you, Betsy, Matt. You guys are so kind. Thank you for joining us. Make sure to let people know if they think this would be helpful, that it's now going to be, as soon as we're done, on the Facebook and YouTube IOCDF. So make sure to check that out. Always go to IOCDF.org for all of your OCD information. We'll be back next week with John Abramowitz and Kyle King for Research Roundtable. And then the following week, the following Wednesday on April 19th, at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 Eastern, we will have Steve join us. So we'll still answer your general OCD questions, but we'll have a psychiatrist to answer those medication questions as well. And don't forget to sign up for the upcoming Faith in OCD conference and the upcoming in-person conference in July at iocdf.org/conferences. It's Chris Trondsen here for Ask the Experts. I appreciate everyone that came by. Thank you so much for hanging us. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with Liz and with Steve. And take care and kick OCD's butt. Remember, OCD always lies. Take care.